If you find yourself to be a resident of the Capitol or of the City Hall, as governor or mayor or as president, get off your knees and get to work.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of The Secular Advocate. I'm Mark Dan, Director of Governmental Affairs at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we're taking a deep dive into some focus groups we recently conducted with religiously unaffiliated Gen Z voters in the battleground state of Wisconsin. Joining me in studio in Madison, Wisconsin, is FFRF's legal fellow, Hirsch Joshi.
Hi.
And also, how's it going, Hirsch? Beautiful Madison as the center of the political universe.
I mean, everyone here loves Madison. We know from years ago with Supreme Court races and governor races how amazing Wisconsin can be.
All right. So, buckle in for another 60 days. So The Secular Advocate, our show today, is a production of the FFRF Action Fund, a 501c4 organization that develops and advocates for legislation, regulations, and government programs to preserve the constitutional principle of the separation of religion and government.
Joining us today is Matthew McDermott, Senior Vice President at Whitman Insight Strategies, which helped us conduct the focus groups. Matt is a leading strategist to a wide range of candidates, advocacy groups, nonprofits, and foundations, as well as brand clients. And Matt, before we get into the data our focus groups revealed, can you talk a little bit about the rise of Americans who identify as nones or people with no religious identity?
So it's a really great question, and it's a fascinating sort of subsector of voters in the United States today. These are voters that essentially don't identify with any religion, right? They could be atheists, they could be agnostic, they could identify as none of the above. Overall in the electorate, they're about 1 in 5 voters nationally. But when you start looking at young voters, Gen Z voters, millennial voters, we're talking almost half of voters, depending on the state, are no longer identifying with a religion. So particularly when we think about the role of young voters in this election, when we think about the role of mobilizing young voters in this election, it's a huge cohort of voters who we ultimately need to engage to turn out and vote in this election.
So tell us a little bit more about the trends you're seeing with Gen Z. So according to the Survey Center on American Life, 34% of Gen Z identifies as religiously unaffiliated. That's more than any other generation alive right now. Isn't that right?
It's exactly right. And I think it is a unique trend among younger voters. And what's particularly interesting is both sort of the challenge and opportunity in engaging these younger, non-affiliated religious voters, in part because when you look at other identity groups, right, those who are part of the LGBTQ community, Black, Brown, Latino voters, AAPI voters, there's a real sort of community there, right? They raise their hand and say, I identify with this community. And they also identify with values and messaging that is particularly resonant to those subsets of the electorate. Non-affiliated religious voters are unique in the sense that a lot of these voters don't raise their hand and identify as that, right? They have a core set of values. Part of what we explored in this research is how you engage them, how you message these types of voters to really align with those values that they identify with. But it's not sort of that traditional community that you might find with other subsets of voters. So on one hand, a really sort of growing, sizable portion of the electorate. On the other, just quite frankly, one that has sort of been untapped to date, hasn't really been engaged through the lens of a cohesive community of voters.
Sure. And before we get to those values, why don't we talk a little bit more about why we wanted to learn about these young voters and why they're being religiously unaffiliated. And Mark, I think you have an answer for that.
Yeah, so a lot of the reason why we developed the focus groups is first, we've got this new great toy with the C4 with the Action Fund, and we're able to get in and get involved in some of these broader electoral questions and really see what's happening and motivating this part of the electorate. Plus, Annie-Laurie Gaylor, our chair of the board, had a really good idea that we can utilize focus groups, and we also utilize the expertise of Sean Malloy, who's one of our board members on the Action Fund. Plus, we're located in Wisconsin, so we have a lot of expertise in the state. And for a lot of reasons that you and Matt were discussing, of just youth voters being such a critical demographic, not a whole lot of research and knowledge has been developed around these voters, and especially developing more of a non-religious identity. And plus, over time, we're aiming to be the key organization that's going to be able to reach secular voters and encourage them to get to the polls.
Sure. And Mark, you mentioned C4 as opposed to a C3. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what that entails and what privileges accompany a C4 versus a C3? Does it just mean I could say the word Republican and Democrat without any fear, or what exactly is happening with that?
Some of this, that's partially true. So a 501c3 organization, those are what you would think of as your typical charities. So United Way or a homeless shelter or something along those lines, as well as a C3. A C4 organization is primarily a lobbying organization. It can do C3 work, but some amount of that time, as long as it and doesn't use tax-deductible funds, can be utilized for electoral work. So engaging the electorate certainly counts, working on get out the vote efforts, joining other organizations through America Votes, which is kind of a coalition of more center-left organizations. We're able to do that as well. And we can advocate for the election of certain candidates. So if you've had a chance to visit our website, ffrfaction.org, you can see a lot of our newly endorsed candidates who have a clear, viable path to victory, support the separation of church and state, and are going to make fantastic elected officials. So with the focus groups that took place in the early part of the summer, and it was before President Biden chose not to seek re-election, what do you think has changed in the minds of the religiously unaffiliated voters in Wisconsin about the election and their place in it, now that Biden is no longer a candidate?
Well, candidly, a lot. And I think one of the opportunities that the Democratic Party has is one of the big learnings out of these focus groups was the extent to which younger nuns, those who don't affiliate with a religion, the extent to which they don't feel like they have a voice in politics today. That was one of the profound sentiments we heard throughout these focus groups, is that we were going into an election cycle at the time with President Biden running for re-election, former President Trump obviously securing the Republican nomination, and they weren't seeing any candidate in the field of presidential nominees as really representing their values, representing what they want to see over the coming years, representing the future they are hoping to craft over the next decade or two. And I think the biggest thing that's obviously changed is there is now a nominee for the Democratic Party in Vice President Harris, who I think for a lot of these younger voters reflects those values and the vision they want to see for the future. And so you can see that there's been a lot of public polling over the past few weeks now that the vice president had secured the nomination, basically painting that picture, right? Enthusiasm is up significantly. Interest in voting in this election is up significantly, in large part because they're finally seeing a candidate in Kamala Harris that represents that vision that was so sorely lacking prior to the president deciding not to run for re-election.
Now, the focus groups revealed that Gen Z voters in Wisconsin are profoundly concerned about the direction of the country, but remain cautiously optimistic about progress, as you did reflect. Now, how do you think these sentiments reflect broader trends you've observed nationally among Gen Z voters, particularly in relation to economic issues and personal freedoms that we've seen under attack over the last few years?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I think one of the pieces of conventional wisdom that's thrown around related to younger voters in America today is that there's some fundamentally unique cohort of voters, that they have a different set of values, they have a different set of issue care abouts. And I think these focus groups reveal, as does other recent research, that that's fundamentally untrue. Younger voters are facing the same challenges, anxieties, stresses, as everyday voters are facing. And so I think one of the things we wanted to explore in these focus groups is around some of those issues in the zeitgeist, right? We continue to think about the impact on the war in Gaza and how that, for instance, impacts how younger voters are thinking about this election. we explored that in the focus groups. And what we actually come to find is not that those issues aren't important, but the same economic anxieties, the same concerns related to access and personal freedom are the same issues among younger voters as they are among voters overall. And so I think that is actually an important lesson out of these groups, is that when we talk to younger voters, things like inflation, things like cost of living, things like housing affordability, the same issues that when you talk to older voters are top of mind and concerns for them are the same issues that are driving interest, engagement, and importance among younger voters as well.
So in the focus groups, we saw that Gen Z voters in Wisconsin see that their voices carry more weight given that they live in a swing state. So how do campaigns harness this energy?
It's a great question. And I think it is important for those who are mobilizing voters in all of the swing states, which is that young voters are smart. They understand the role and the importance of their vote, particularly when they live in one of these 7 swing states. We obviously conducted these focus groups in Wisconsin, but I think you could apply the same learnings to Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. Voters in these states, particularly younger voters who are attuned to the news, attuned to the campaign cycle, understand their vote has outsized importance. We talked to a number of younger voters in Wisconsin who basically admit that they understand that their vote counts 40, 50, 100 times more than a voter, let's say, in a state like Massachusetts or New York, because they understand the Electoral College, they understand the importance of their vote in the ultimate outcome of the Electoral College. And so when we think about messaging opportunities, I think one of the important learnings is we should explicitly communicate that. We should underscore for younger voters the outsized importance of their vote in states like Wisconsin, because not only is it true, but it helps to ultimately increase their interest and engagement in voting in a presidential election like this. The one thing I'll sort of add in addition is in a number of these swing states, and including Wisconsin, we've got a number of other particularly important and competitive elections on the ballot as well, right? You've got the Senate race in Wisconsin with Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin running for re-election. And I think having races of importance like that on the ballot matters as well. Again, because these younger voters are attuned to issues that are going on, attuned to the news environment, and understand that their vote has an outsized importance in not only the presidential race, but ultimately in securing majorities in Congress for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I was also one of the things that I saw that I was a little surprised about is how in our focus group cohorts that you saw very sophisticated, very deep thinking on the importance of voting, that they saw it as a multi-year project. They see how it voting works in other ways. And clearly, I think what they said made a whole lot of social studies teachers across the country very, very proud. And that, I think, is just a really great thing seeing in younger generations, and hopefully that enthusiasm that we are seeing a little bit more at the top of the ticket does translate to lasting gains and people engaging on the local level, which is something we're trying to promote during with the Action Fund.
I think that's exactly right, and I know this was alluded to earlier, but despite the cynicism, the level of apathy, the consternation that younger voters in these focus groups felt towards the current state of politics in America today, in looking forward towards the election, where obviously we now have a new Democratic candidate in Kamala Harris. Despite all of that, there was still that sort of flame of optimism, right? And there was an understanding that your vote, while important in this election, is not the end-all be-all, right? That there is a large lift to be done coming out of an election cycle like this to seek the change you want, to seek the future and the vision of that future that you want. And so I think that's important, right? Because, I think on one hand, over the past few weeks, we've seen a marked change in terms of just enthusiasm and motivation for voting in this election among younger voters, which is great, right? We obviously want to maximize turnout in this election. But I do think it's important that younger voters are recognizing, as is true, that change takes time, right? that, as former President Obama talked about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice, that doesn't happen overnight. And so while I think it's obviously critically important in these next coming weeks to focus on engagement and mobilization ahead of the election, I think moving forward, there are indications among the electorate, including among younger voters, that there's recognition that there's work still ahead coming out of November to seek some of those changes that younger voters are hoping for.
And one of the things, and also if folks at home want to check out a lot of the really good work Matt and his team did and sort of the raw data that with our focus groups, you can go to ffrfaction.org and you can see the focus groups for yourself. Or you can just scan the barcode and it'll take you right there. And one of the things, and Hirsch and Matt, I want to get your opinion on, is that there was a little bit of a queasiness in some of the focus groups that overarching, overly flowery language, maybe alluding to hope and change, didn't exactly get a great thing, that it seemed a little flowery. What do you all think of that?
Just from my perspective as someone from Gen Z, hope and change, that's not a policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Concrete policy is something that would matter to people who are uncertain about when they're going to buy a house, how they're going to pay off school debt, and things like that. So while hope and change are certainly welcome and definitely resoundingly different than what we might see otherwise, it's not a real policy. It's not something that actually helps anyone. It doesn't really even result in anything tangible, right? I mean, if you're concerned about making sure that people are not homeless or houseless, really hope and change doesn't do anything for that. So yeah, I think the queasiness is more of sort of this jaded aspect that, it doesn't really do anything. It's welcome and it's good, but it's nothing. It's empty.
I would very much echo all of those sentiments, and I think they're exactly right. One of the learnings out of these focus groups, as you just alluded to, Mark, is the need to really champion issues when we think about messaging. And that word that was just used a moment ago, tangibility, is exactly the reason why. This is a generation, inclusive, I'll say, of millennials, right? These are not just Gen Z voters. We see the same thing when we engage millennial voters. These are generations that have lived through a lot. Even those who are in their late teens, early 20s, have lived through a global pandemic, have lived through a recession, have lived through a period of macroeconomic impact when it comes to job loss. And it happened during a time when they were just coming out of college. They have seen the real world in a way many generations have not. And so that tangibility is important, right? When we talk about cost of living and issues related to inflation, when we talk about housing unaffordability, these are voters that are looking for tangible ways in which a future administration is going to help to address those challenges that are facing them in their everyday life, which, again, is not to discount sort of the aspiration of the moment, right? I think particularly sort of to put in context, we did these focus groups prior to President Biden deciding he wasn't going to run for re-election. When you're faced with two candidates who you don't really like, who you sort of wish you had another option, that tangibility is always going to be at the forefront, right? I think there's a sort of renewed aspiration in the electorate with Kamala Harris and Tim Waltz as the Democratic nominee now. But I don't think that in any way discounts what we heard, which is leaning into the tangibility is critically important. And I think to the benefit of the Harris-Waltz ticket, they are doing exactly that, right? You've seen the campaign come out with policies related to how they're going to address housing unaffordability, how they're going to sort of work in partnership and at times go after big corporations in America to tackle price gouging related to inflation. So I think the campaign is doing what they need to sort of lean into some of those policy issues, knowing that the tangibility of those issue areas is so critically important for younger voters.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Go for it. Just wanted to ask you a follow-up about it.
Yeah, sure. All I was going to say is, if you really just contrast those two general images of candidates that we have. Hope and change is better than just pure racism and bigotry. I'm not, let me just go out and say that. It might be controversial, but I'm going to go ahead and say that on behalf of all of Gen Z. But, I think having more tangible solutions and something that you can actually say, okay, that is a good thing that will make life better for so many people. That's something Gen Z values, and eventually I'm sure we're going to get a lot more policies like that. And credit to the current administration that has tried to do that through the FTC, through other rulemaking agencies, including on Title IX. The Biden administration has tried to do that. So if the Harris administration or Harris campaign says we're just going to do that again, I think that is welcome. But if we're just comparing messaging, one might have my vote over the other.
That's fantastic. And I just want to ask you, so in the focus groups, there was definitely a sense that neither candidate was speaking to the needs of Gen Z voters. And obviously, from what you've seen, have you noticed a tonal shift? Do you think it's sufficient? Do you think the campaigns need to do more to address the needs of younger voters?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say without a doubt, there has been not only a tonal shift, but I think a macro level shift in the environment towards a renewed sense of not only aspiration, but inspiration in the Democratic ticket that voters now have the choice to elect in this November, in part because I think in a lot of ways that sort of change that happened at the top of the ticket over the past 2 months is really emblematic of exactly what we heard in these focus groups that Gen Z was hoping for in this election, which is they want elected officials, they want politicians to listen to them. And what young voters have been shouting from the rooftops for the better part of the last 2 years is, we want a different choice in this election, and we want a choice that better represents not only our values and our issue priorities, but represents having a more youthful voice in the White House than the prior two administrations. And so in a lot of ways, I think the change itself in passing the torch to Kamala Harris and Tim Walz in many ways addressed that change that young voters were hoping for. So look, it's not, again, to discount the work that needs to be done between now and November. It's not to discount the need for this ticket to talk about issues that are of importance and priority to younger voters. But I think the change itself helped to answer that yearning desire that young voters were looking for, which was another choice in the election.
And Hirsch, do you think that's sufficient, another choice, or are you seeing the issues you think younger voters would be interested in? Are you seeing a difference, or to give us a little bit more insight?
Yeah, I mean, I think from just now, I'm going to go away from speaking on Gen Z's behalf to just my own. When one side, when one option is just to bully kids, right, into picking what they can't read, what they can't say about themselves, how they can't express themselves at school, versus giving them the option to and protecting them, it's not really a choice, right? I mean, there's just one that's quite superior to the other. Gen Z, we don't like people who bully gay kids, right? That's unacceptable. And there's one choice that does that, and there's one choice that doesn't. So I don't think it's really unclear or ambiguous, to me at least. Yes, my answer to your question is yes. It is pretty clear there are these trends and shifts, but I don't think that there's going to be too much of a difference on that one issue between the two administrations, between the Biden administration and the Harris campaign.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your insight, Hirsch.
Sure. So the research indicates that Gen Z voters, like myself, are turned off by divisiveness, us versus them rhetoric, and prefer messages focused on collective action and issue-based campaigning. How should political campaigns adjust their messaging to avoid alienating these voters while still highlighting the stakes of the election?
I think it's a critically important sort of tonality point when it comes to messaging for young voters, which is, to step back and recognize that for these younger voters, you look at the 2020 election, you look at the 2016 election, entrenched in both of those elections was an enormous amount of toxic rhetoric, right? It was us versus them, admittedly on both sides, right? Sort of pitting the two parties against each other. And I think one thing we heard consistently in these focus groups when it comes to that tonality is it just doesn't work. And I think this is true of the electorate writ large, but it's most sort of profoundly seen among young voters, is that they are looking for a candidate and frankly looking for a political party that can mend the division of the past decade and move this country collectively towards a better, more aspirational future. And so that's important, right? Is it means that just belittling, degrading, dehumanizing the other side, it's just not effective rhetoric. It's why I think the Republican Party under Donald Trump has struggled so significantly with young voters. But I think there's lessons for Democrats in that too, which is that these are voters that are looking for a sense of community, right? So not only should we be avoiding us versus them framework in how we talk about messaging, but we should also be talking about the collective community, about bringing people together to do the work that's needed to secure some of the changes that young voters are seeking in the future. I think that was one of the other big takeaways out of these focus groups is when we message to young voters, it's not about the individual and their own individual interests, but this is also a generation that's uniquely focused on the collective and how we, not only as young voters, but sort of the zeitgeist of America writ large, can finally come together, can finally turn the page on the toxicity of the past decade and really focus and move past the era of Donald Trump to focus on those issues that matter most.
So, Matt, one of the things that's been coming out recently is the Trump campaign's outreach to young male voters, going hard into, for lack of better terms, bro topics and bro forums and things along those lines. We didn't quite see that penetrating into our focus groups or things along those lines. It may have been before we did the focus groups, before that those outreach efforts started to really ramp up, or it might be something about non-religious voters. Can you provide a little bit of insight to that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I don't think there's any doubt that there not only has been a unique focus among Republicans over the past few years at this point in engaging particularly young men on, issues of, let's just say broadly, masculinity, right? It's why they lean into media outlets like the Joe Rogan Show. It's why they lean into Twitch and other platforms where they're sort of focused on engaging younger men. And they're trying to basically create a wedge, right? A moral wedge, a cultural wedge about the role of gender in society. It is basically the counter effect of, for a long time, issue messaging focused on women, the role of women in society. Obviously now the importance of women's reproductive rights and abortion rights in this election. It's in many ways the counter effect to that. And I think younger men, in their own words, sort of feeling left behind and left out of the conversation. And Republicans have tried to co-opt that. And I won't sort of discount the impact that has had, right? You could see it in polling this year. I think we're in a better place now. But when you look at polling from earlier this year, Democrats were struggling with young voters, a cohort of voters that typically Democrats are able to win by 25, 30 points. Joe Biden and Donald Trump were essentially tied among younger voters. Biden maybe had a 5-10 point advantage there, but nothing compared to what we had seen in previous elections. And that was almost entirely driven by younger men. I think in polling over the past few weeks, with Harris now at the top of the ticket, you see Democrats rebounding among young voters. There was polling out just this week from Suffolk University that has Democrats now winning young voters by about 15, 20 points. New York Times had polling that has it more at 20 or 25 points. So I think we've seen some improvement there. But I think the long-term point of your question is still relevant, which is Democrats need to figure out how to crack the echo chamber environment that young men are engaged in right now, not only for the long-term health of our country, but also as we think about societal impacts related to gender dynamics, it is a long-term challenge that this party needs to think about.
And when I mean young men, I mean more straight men. And do you think do you think Tim Waltz is part of the antidote to that?
Very much, right? I think having men in elected office who look like, sound like, come from backgrounds like everyday Americans is hugely important. I'll also, as the husband of a teacher, give a shout out to his experience and background and history of being a teacher. I think having public educators in office is incredibly valuable, not only to be able to have a seat at the table for educators in our country, but as people who understand and work firsthand with the children of the future every single day, understand the issues they're going through, understand the challenges that kids in school are facing these days. I think Tim Walz is going to be an enormous voice for that type of progress in the White House because of his understanding of kids from his time as a teacher.
Yeah, I've always thought if you can handle 10th graders in the classroom, Putin really shouldn't scare you that much. So with that, so thanks for those ideas, and Hirsch.
Sure. So the focus groups highlighted that economic challenges are a top priority for Gen Z voters who feel that the economy is fundamentally not working for everyday Americans. So what specific economic messages resonated most with Gen Z in your research, and how can these insights inform broader campaign strategies?
It speaks to sort of just the conundrum of our economy right now, right? You have record low unemployment. You have a stock market that day in and day out is hitting or outpacing record highs. The economy is humming along. And increasingly, you look at sort of metrics from Wall Street that would suggest we're probably not in the realm of seeing a recession anytime soon. And yet, every single one of us is feeling the challenges of this economy in our day-to-day lives in the most tangible way, right? Going out and buying things, the ability to afford going on vacation once in a while, the ability to put money into a house or an apartment or a condo, right? These are everyday challenges that are particularly impacting younger voters who come out of college and are looking at an economy that's just not built for them to take advantage of. And so I think it's important for both parties, though I would argue that the Harris campaign is doing a better job of this, of really putting forth policies that address those everyday tangible challenges that younger voters are facing. They've obviously, as we sort of mentioned earlier, have put forth policies related to basically financing related to a down payment on your first home. They've put policies together related to how the government can step in and tamp down price gouging, which we know, in addition to inflation, is causing some of those higher price points when you go and buy things like groceries. And so I think it's going to really take a hands-on approach from this next administration to not only address these issues, but do so in a way that tangibly benefits everyday Americans, younger voters in the near term. Because I think that's one of the challenges of the past few years is, the Biden administration saw this firsthand when you look at the infrastructure bill, right? One of the largest investments in green technology and renewable energy in American history. But those are policies that take 5, 10, 15 years to actually manifest and see the impact of it. I think the Harris administration, assuming they win this election, is going to have to be focused on those near-term realities of getting costs down, making housing more affordable and realistic for everyday Americans, to be able to revert some of those negative perceptions around the economy today.
And so as we kind of look to close out our discussion, so let's assume you're the Trump campaign and you got this research. What would you be doing, or would it just be like, that's cute, we think we can win with what we got?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Thankfully, I'm not in that position. But you can see actually in practice what the Trump campaign has tried to do over the past 6 months or so. Their first attempt was to say, we're never going to win these voters. So how many other candidates can we throw into this field of presidential candidates to get us into a position where they're taking votes away from the Democratic nominee and giving us enough of a chance to win this election, right? They propped up Cornel West in trying to get him on the ballot in a number of states. They obviously propped up and a number of Trump's largest campaign donors supported RFK Jr., who's now obviously left the race and unsurprisingly endorsed Donald Trump. So that was their first effort, right? How do we get as many candidates as we can into the race to just muddy the waters and hope that these voters don't turn out for Kamala Harris? I think what they're now doing in addition to that is quite honestly trying to demotivate voters, right? They see in the polling, as is publicly available, that they are very unpopular, particularly among younger voters. And the challenge for them right now, coming off of the passing of the torch moment, is Kamala Harris is pretty well darn liked among voters. She's actually the first nominee for a major party in a number of election cycles that actually has a net positive favorability among voters. And that's particularly true among younger voters. So I think what we're going to see over the next few weeks is their effort to try to tamp down that favorability, to try to make her unlikable, not so that those votes are going to transfer to Donald Trump, but so that those voters don't turn out come election day. And so I think that is why efforts among Democrats to really mobilize and engage and turn out voters, particularly younger voters, is so critical over the next month and a half, because every effort will be made among Republicans to try to motivate and demobilize younger voters. I don't think it's going to work, but that's the strategy you do when you realize you're not going to win these voters. It's how do I make sure they don't actually come out and vote come election day?
And in the focus groups, we saw that that a lot of folks in our cohort were interested in voting, and we assumed that there was not going to be that interest as well. And so I think there's been a lot of evidence that can be built from Kamala Harris coming in, other enthusiasm around down ticket races. And then you said something really important. So Cornel West is getting money for the Republicans? That's interesting.
Yeah, it's you've seen from a number of candidates, right? Technically the Green Party candidate and Jill Stein, who for all intents and purposes is parroting Republican talking points from time to time and having Republican operatives get third-party candidates like this on the ballot. I think what we're increasingly seeing is those third-party candidates are being propped up by Republican money, by Republican stakeholders who are hoping they take votes away from the Democratic nominee. Well, one thing I'll sort of mention sort of as we start to wrap too, though, is I think the Harris campaign has smartly co-opted a core value of younger voters that we heard throughout these focus groups. The word freedom came up time and time again in our focus groups, and it had a much broader definition than we might typically understand it to be. They use freedom to talk about personal liberties. They use freedom to talk about reproductive and abortion rights. They use freedom to talk about LGBTQ rights and the importance of having LGBTQ representation, trans representation at the table. So young voters were already sort of using this broader idea and definition of freedom. I think the Harris campaign has pretty smartly co-opted that same definition of freedom and is using it as really their mantle and mantra in this campaign. So I just wanted to share that because as much as we talk about sort of the tangible issues that are important to Gen Z voters, there still does need to be an aspirational values-based message. And I think the one that we consistently heard in these groups around freedom is exactly in many ways the one that's been adopted by the Harris and Waltz campaign.
So I actually have one last question for you. We've talked about everybody except for one famous person, J.D. Vance. So what have you seen in terms of Gen Z and how much they hate or like J.D. Vance? And can you really just couch it in terms that any of us can understand?
The memeability of J.D. Vance. Look, voters are looking for authentic candidates, right? Particularly younger voters who are jaded in many ways by the decade of politics that we've had to endure. They're looking for authenticity. And I think there is no better comparable dynamic on the question of authenticity than the dynamic we see right now between Tim Walz, who's just a good-hearted, good-natured, salt-of-the-earth guy who's in politics for all of the right reasons, having gone from a public educator to someone who served his country on through to running for Congress in an incredibly red district, flipping that district, and then ultimately running for governor. He's in it for the right reasons. People can see through J.D. Vance. And I think that's the reality here. Beyond all the memes, all the social media commentary about J.D. Vance, he's just not honest guy, and his rise into politics for the same reasons was incredibly dishonest, right? He talks about his time growing up in Appalachia, even though he grew up nowhere near Appalachia. He ultimately basically got bankrolled out of college to go start a venture capitalist firm, working in Silicon Valley for a number of years, whereas, Tim Walz had never even visited San Francisco until a month or two ago, right? Like, there's just a massive dynamic between these two candidates. And I think younger voters in particular are able to see through that lack of inauthenticity or that lack of authenticity and see what a fraud he is.
Yeah. And Hirsch and Matt, going into the debates coming up in, I guess, under a week, what do you think Gen Z voters are going to be looking for in the debate, and what would your recommendations be for either candidate?
I just want to see a competent candidate get up there and talk about something that I care about. Well, look, credit to Joe Biden for his administration, but I think to see Kamala Harris go up there and, sell the points that she has been selling over the last few years would be really revitalizing and really reassuring in terms of trust that you can have in a president and the administration. So I kind of want her to just embarrass Trump in some way, but also to actually get out those cogent points that we've been discussing today.
And Matt?
And I think from my perspective, look, America, including young voters, is looking for a change agent in this election. And I think both of the candidates are challenged in presenting that narrative, right? You've obviously got Kamala Harris, who is the current vice president in the current administration. But you've got Donald Trump, who used to, up until a few years ago, be president of the United States. And so one of the challenges they both face is how do you act and present yourself as a change agent when both of you have been in office and both have been in the White House? I think Kamala Harris has figured out how to weave that message most effectively, right? And I think to her credit, she has the ability to communicate that message, right? She's not president right now. There are roles and functions of being vice president that do not give you decision-making authority when it comes to the goals and priorities of any administration. And so I think she has a natural ability to say, look, I have defended, supported, and encouraged everything of this administration, but we can do more. And here's what that more looks like. Donald Trump struggles with that message because as much as he likes to sit there and present that he is a change agent and he's going to, revert some of the policies of the Biden administration, the reality is he was in government 3 years ago. And where did it lead us? A massive global pandemic, a recession, tens of millions of our fellow Americans out of work and unemployed, a housing crisis that got out of control under his watch. So as much as Trump, I think, is going to try to lean into the fact that he is, in fact, the change agent in this race, we all have eyes. We all lived through the 4 years of his administration. And I think it's just that much tougher of a message for him to be able to narrate.
Sounds good.
Matthew, thank you so much for coming on to our show this week.
That wraps up the first episode of The Secular Advocate. You definitely noticed we were able to get into more political discussions and what is happening in the electorate. So look for more episodes of The Secular Advocate. And if you want even more information about the FFR Action Fund, which The Secular Advocate is part of, check out our website, ffrfaction.org. Plus, you can also check out a lot of all the information on the focus groups that we've referenced on the show. So please also consider becoming an advocate yourself or making a donation to help us defend America's secular principles. And see you next time on The Secular Advocate.